Hey guys, it's Nick. The Evergrande crisis in China seems to have died down a little bit in the news, but it has actually spawned a new crisis for the mortgage boycotts you may be hearing about. The mortgage strike, which kicked off in late June in a stalled Evergrande development in Jingdezhen, has rapidly grown to at least 301 projects in about 91 cities. So, does this have the potential to influence more buyers to stop paying their mortgages and possibly put the Chinese banks at risk? Or is this just an overhyped story that is a small portion of the Chinese real estate market? The mortgage strike is not about people who just felt like not paying their mortgages anymore. There are some very good reasons for it. In China, when people buy a new construction building, they start paying the mortgage for the full purchase price before the project is even finished, maybe even before construction is started in some cases. In other countries, people are required to put up some kind of deposit for new construction just to get the pre construction discounted price. So, paying a mortgage on a pre construction building for 2 or 3 years may not be that much different than paying a 10 or 20% deposit like buyers do in some other countries. In normal times in China, this was not a problem because builders were finishing their projects quickly and on time, and housing prices were always rising. It's only now that these two things are no longer the case that buyers are refusing to continue paying their mortgages. This problem started from developers like Evergrande and many others that are having problems paying their debt and have stopped or slowed down completion of projects. Many contractors who are owed money by developers are also refusing to continue on projects. Then there's also the recent inflation in materials that has made the completion of these projects much more expensive than originally planned. And adding to these problems is China's three red lines rule, which has dried up the borrowing ability of developers. Those three red lines were implemented in 2021, and they are that the asset to liability ratio must be greater than 70%. Net debt to equity ratio must be less than 100%, and cash to short term borrowings ratio must be less than 1. So let's have a look at what's going on over there. Now, just to show you how important real estate is in China compared to other countries, let's look at this chart here. The residential property in China is worth about 62 trillion. In the US, residential property is only 34 versus 48 for bonds and 47 for equity. And the real estate sector is about 30% of China GDP, so it is really big and really important in China. Now, Bloomberg is saying in addition to buyers boycotting their mortgages, also some suppliers to Chinese real estate developers are now also refusing to pay back bank loans because of unpaid bills owed to them. So this could be a sign that the loan boycott is spreading past just home buyers to suppliers and contractors. They say one group of small businesses and suppliers circulated a letter online saying they will stop repaying debts after Evergrande's cash crisis left them out of pocket. We decided to stop paying all loans and arrears and advise our peers to decline any request to be paid on credit or commercial bill. Evergrande should be held responsible for any consequence that follows because of the chain reaction of the supply chain crisis. So this problem could spiral out of control for the Chinese government because they say relief for some borrowers could prompt threats of non-payment by a whole host of others. And while bending to demands for support could put a strain on state finances, ignoring them might lead to a spiral of defaults as more and more borrowers refuse to meet their obligations. So, what percent of these boycotted mortgages are of all of the mortgages that banks hold in China? Chinese banks say that it's only about $311 million of credit risk, but GF Securities expects that as much as 2 trillion won of mortgages could be impacted by the boycott. That's about 1,000 times more than 311 million or $311 billion. So even if it is closer to the 2 trillion won number, Chinese banks have 38 trillion won of outstanding mortgages. So that's only about 5% of the total mortgages that banks hold for residential mortgages. And they also have 13 trillion won of loans to the country's developers. And this article in the South China Morning Post said that the value of the mortgages is more like 1.1 trillion won, or like about $160 billion. And that's far less than the 7.5 trillion won loss that the banking system can bear before triggering a systemic risk, says DBS Bank. But most of these unfinished projects are in less developed regions that have smaller Chinese banks that have loaned to these mortgages. So they have a larger exposure to distressed home builders. And systemic risk is unlikely and earnings impact is not as big as thought, said an analyst. We expect the government to step in to solve this problem as it may affect more than 3 trillion won of residential sales and about 4 million families. But a state intervention could force banks to shoulder 30% of the costs of fixing the problem. So, after the Chinese government made it harder for developers to borrow with the 3 red lines, now they are telling lenders to loosen their credit taps to help beleaguered developers complete their homes. And this article explains why people are holding back their mortgages because 3/4 of China's most indebted developers have missed completion and handover deadlines. And so this borrower boycott is spread through open letters on social media like places like WeChat, and it says it has spread like wildfire. Now, here's an example of somebody who actually bought one of these homes and is not paying the mortgage anymore. Sam Chen bought a home being built by China South City in eastern Jiangxi. And he's one of those who's been drowning in the aftermath of the country's liquidity tsunami for developers. So, after signing for the home in July 2020, he has spent 2 years struggling to pay his 2 million won, $296,000 mortgage at a rate of 7,000 won per month. That's about $1,000 a month. So he says, what did I do wrong? That is the question that I have constantly asked myself in the past year, said Chen, who was supposed to be able to move into his 190 square meter or about 1,900 square feet condo last September. So he was promised this apartment almost a year earlier and he hasn't gotten it yet. He says, probably ever since the moment I decided to buy this house, my whole life just cannot be right again. After construction halted in mid 2021, Chen and hundreds of other homebuyers did not get a direct answer from the developer. News about China South City finally came in January when it was revealed that the developer begged its creditors to extend 2 US dollar denominated bonds totaling 700 million. So the creditor is having problems, so he doesn't know if they're going to be around to finish this thing. So why should he keep paying, right? On a recent visit, Chen's condo sat in a shell of a building among dozens of others, some 3 kilometers walk from the city's government, with windows and pipes for gas and sewage nowhere to be found. And so they said the Chinese property sector went into a tailspin last year when central banks stepped up enforcements of its so-called 3 red lines on debt limits, and that choked off bank funding for companies that were already deep in debt. And so that made problems worse in a market beaten down by strict rules enacted in 2017 to rein in runaway prices. And so as a result, developers could not sell homes to generate cash, causing a rise in bond defaults and missed payments. And if you don't know, the China Evergrande Group holds the dubious honor of being the world's most indebted developer with $300 billion in liabilities. And to see how bad it is, they say that 18 or more than 75% of China's distressed developers have more than one project with home deliveries that have been delayed for anywhere from 6 months to more than a year. So not only are these buyers having to wait 6 months, a year, or more from when they were promised their home, but New home prices are not rising anymore. Now they are falling. So I'm sure buyers are worried that by the time, if they ever get their completed house, maybe it will be worth less than what they paid for it. I think what these buyers are doing isn't much different than what anyone else would do in this situation. They may have serious doubts about whether these developers survive or go bankrupt. And if they go bankrupt, you become a creditor that will get back pennies on the dollar. So why continue to throw good money after bad into this? The developers broke their contract first by not completing the projects. Now, can something like this possibly happen in the US? Well, it kind of already did, and it was actually much worse than what they are doing in China. What they're doing in China is much different than what happened during the housing bubble here around 2008, 2009. See, in the US, people stopped paying their mortgages on houses that they bought and were living in. Why? Not because they couldn't afford them, but because they bought their house for, say, $500,000 2 years earlier, and now identical houses on their block are selling for $300,000. So some people actually went out and bought the cheaper house while they still had decent credit and then went and defaulted on the mortgage on their $500,000 identical house. Now, the prices for new homes in China have not dropped anywhere close to our housing bubble, and I don't know what the consequences are for walking away from a mortgage in China, but people are usually rational when it comes to large amounts of money. So, if home prices started skyrocketing in China, you could be sure that they would start paying their mortgages again. And if home prices started to fall heavily in China, you can expect more people to boycott or just walk away from these mortgages. Right now, the boycott doesn't seem to be a huge risk to banks and the economy, but if it does start to get worse, I'm sure the Chinese government will take more steps to make sure it doesn't spiral out of control. It should be interesting to see how this plays out, and I'm sure governments in other countries don't want any of their debt slaves to get any ideas from the Chinese. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one.